is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The task that you have entrusted me with is quite heavy: to serve Africa in all its diversity and in its various different shapes, contradictions, and even work with its differences. It is not easy, but challenges have never frightened me. I therefore commit myself in front of you to take up this responsibility with all my strength and commitment.
A continent of different shapes and contradictions. Those were the sentiments of the newly elected Moussa Faki Mahamat as he accepted the responsibility of the African Union Commission chair. But as the former Chadian foreign minister takes up that position, he is charged with not only leading a continental body that faces imminent reform, but also with steering the African Union through a larger global change, as notable major economies seem to be turning away from globalization in favor of their own private interests. So what kind of reforms can be expected following last month's annual summit? And what kind of leadership will be required for the African Union in the new era? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. The African Union has a new Commission chair. Chad's Foreign Minister Moussa Faki Mahamat will take over the reins from South African Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma after continental leaders voted at the African Union summit in Addis Ababa late last month. But who is Mahamat and what qualifies him to run the African Union Commission? CGTN's Tulisha Balala takes a closer look.
Moussa Faki Mahamat was born in 1960 in eastern Chad. He attended university in the Republic of Congo. There he studied law. He went into exile in the 1980s when notorious Chadian dictator Hissène Habré came to power. Mahamat eventually returned to Chad 10 years later and served as the country's prime minister until the early 2000s. He resigned from that post during a civil service strike. He was president of the Economic, Social and Cultural Council from 2007 to 2008. Since April 2008, Mahamat has been the foreign minister of Chad under President Idriss Déby. During campaigning to be the African Union chairperson, Mahamat prioritized development on the continent and eradicating terror groups such as Boko Haram. Chad has been playing a key role in the battle against the Nigerian group. It's likely as the new AU Commission chair, Mahamat will make eradicating Boko Haram a priority. As a francophone nation, Chad also has strong ties with France. The new AUC chairman will be looking to deepen the AU's relationship with Paris. Tuli Shabalala, CGTN.
And now to offer further analysis into the direction the African Union might take under Mahamat's leadership, I have expert guests standing by. In Lagos, Fisayo Alo, he's a senior researcher at Good Governance Africa, and with me in Nairobi, political scientist and expert on the African Union, Muthoni Wanyeki. To you both, thank you for joining in this conversation. Muthoni, I'll start off with you. The African Union Commission has a new chair. First, your assessment of the new AUC chair and the direction he's likely to take the AU.
Well, in some ways, he already has a blueprint in terms of the direction the AU needs to take. The Agenda 2063, finalizing the APSA, the African Peace and Security Architecture, moving on the financing proposals and so on. But of course, every individual brings their own expertise to the table and their own interests. Coming from Chad, as someone who had to leave during the regime of Hissène Habré, we've just seen the conclusion of that case, the hybrid between the AU, Senegal. Hopefully he'll also be someone interested in rights issues and justice issues.
Right. Fisayo Alo, in Lagos, your assessment of the new AUC chair?
Well, thank you. I think for Mr. Faki, who is taking on the new leadership of the African Union, really I will expect him now to chart a new course in the direction that would move Africa forward. he would have to think very deeply concerning, in line with the global trend. Africa would have to look inwards to, address some of its problems right now that people are actually, pulling in all their funds. He would need to really rally around the African leaders so that they would be able to do more for the people, and he would have to gather people around leaders to ensure that yes, things are actually done the right way. Because I mean, it's no longer time for refugees to flood other parts of the world. Everybody is trying to shut down their borders, so we would have to look inwards and make our resources work for us in Africa.
Right. Mudoni, we need to look inward to make our resources work for us. Of course, the world is changing now, particularly with the new U.S. president's new administration and his protectionist policies, as well as the Brexit. What is the position of the African Union? Is there room for Africa in all this?
Well, of course. I mean, making room for Africa and asserting Africa is the very reason that the OAU transited to become the AU. I think we saw about 5 years of really positive developments where Africa was leading on the normative front, leading in terms of, the right to intervene in situations of grave crimes, a real determination. The leadership changed somewhat, and its imperatives changed somewhat, and we're hoping that this new leadership will hear loud and clear the imperative to get the AU back on track.
Right. Fisayo, could you just explain to us a bit about looking inward now, because obviously Africa has been talking about expanding their global trade from 3%, but with all these protectionist policies, as you mentioned, Africa has to look forward. To clarify for us, how exactly Africa is going to now need to look inward?
Yeah, thank you. It's no longer business as usual with the world, with the trend right now. We can see what is going on in the US. Africa would have to manage its resources, would have to build capacity to effectively utilize the funds that is coming. There's a lot of potentials in Africa, and most of these things have been wasted over the years. We have poor leadership. We would have to improve on all of these things: leadership abilities, our abilities to manage our resources, so that our resources are no longer, termed as costs for Africa. We have all these things, and yet we have poverty. We would have to raise our people out of poverty. This has to be something that is done deliberately, not something that is going to happen just per instance. We got to sit down to actually plan for this thing. So that's what I mean by looking inwards. We have resources, we have both financial, we have human resources to garner all these things together. So we would have to look inwards and say this is where we want to go, in line with all the agendas and all the policies that have been set. All those policies are good, but then implementing them is what is, the major problem. So we would have to really sit down to implement these policies and agendas that we have set for ourselves.
Right, but President Kagame, while making the proposals for reforms, noted that there have been about 1,500 proposals made so far by the African Union Assembly. Implementation is another key. So where exactly is the challenge here for the AU?
Well, I think in terms of financing, the 0.2%, his team, Kebaruka's team, are quite serious about lobbying the continent to get at least a few countries to begin the wave of African contributions to the Peace Fund and so on. I think they're also quite serious about trying to see how to better merge the peace and security side of the AU with the democratic and good governance side, because it's very clear, yes, the peace and security architecture has evolved, problematic as it is proving to be, and sort of, difficulties and challenges with the architecture, but dealing with root causes, this issue of the human flight of people from Eritrea, for example, or across the Sahel, those are governance questions, and the use of the governance architecture as a conflict prevention measure is also something that they need to move on, and there seems to be a sort of recognition of that within the package of reform proposals, so that's good.
Right, Fisayo Alodo, you talk about a policy implementation. So far, what's your assessment of policy implementation by the AU?
Well, I think over the years, implementation has been very, at a low ebb compared to the, quality of policies or the number of policies that are available. Each member state would have to actually, from the grassroots, begin to push for these policies to be implemented. We need to get our people to begin to demand for good governance, which would now drive these policies being implemented. We need more education for the people to understand what it means, how these policies affect them. If they understand how these policies affect them, they would now be in a better position to demand for those policies to be implemented the way they should be implemented. One thing about implementing the policies is being committed to it. We have a number of African states who pay their dues to the UN but fail to do their obligations to the AU. These are some of the things that has to be looked into going forward. The member states would have to pay, because you can't expect outsiders to fund you and not dictate to you. So that's one way to go forward.
Right, we're going to look at the policies in just a moment, but first, your assessment. Do you think the African Union has delivered today?
I think it's delivered on norms, certainly in terms of saying these are the standards we set for ourselves as African people. What it's not been able to deliver on is the promise of those norms on the ground. And like I said, the direction of travel in the last couple of years has not been good, including blocking civil society and people from engaging with the AU, which was part of the promise of the original AU. But I think, there's new leadership, there's interest, and we need to move forward. I mean, the crises are just too grave.
Right. Fisayo Alo, do you think the African Union has delivered today?
Well, considerably, the African Union has been able to, deliver in certain areas. One can point to the fact that we're beginning to see that, the rule of law is beginning to get established. It's no longer business as usual where they just pet themselves. The African Union is no longer, or we hope that it's no longer going to be a place where heads of states just, they gather together and then they can do what they want to do, and because they know they are going to be protected, or, So on that note, they are beginning to talk to themselves. They are beginning to say, look, we have to move this continent forward. So in that aspect, maybe they have, been able to do more. But more is, expected of the African Union, really.
Right, Fisalo Mudoni, we'll leave it there for the moment. And we are going to take a short break now. But when we come back, we'll have more insights into reforms at the African Union. To stay with us.
Africa is not one story.
The reforms were about how to make the organization and the union as a whole work better. For instance, there are issues around how summits should work. So it's really about making this union a better and efficient organization, how to involve more the civil society, how to make it relevant to the citizens of Africa and not just to governments.
That was outgoing African Union Commission Chair Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma describing the proposed reforms to the African Union. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, during the 27th African Union Summit in Kigali last year, Rwandan President Paul Kagame was assigned by his counterparts to come up with reform proposals for the African Union as part of transforming it into a self-reliant continental body by 2018. The proposals were collated from views gathered from various experts and regional blocs and contained in a report presented at the 28th African Union Summit last month. Let's take a quick look at what some of those were.
Africa must mobilize its own resources to finance activities of the African Union Commission and scale back dependence on donor money if it is to survive. That's according to Paul Kagame. The Rwandan president, along with a 9-person expert committee, have been investigating plans to reform the continental body and presented their findings to fellow heads of state and government at a retreat in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa last month. If implemented, the proposals will realign various AU institutions by ending duplication of roles as well as relinquishing greater responsibility to regional economic communities. Kagame stated that the point is to think strategically about which organization, at which level, is best placed to take the lead in a given case. The AU should focus on a fewer number of priority areas that are by nature continental in scope, such as political affairs, peace and security, economic integration, and Africa's global representation and voice. The proposed reforms revolve around two major areas, mechanisms and financing, but also suggested operational management reforms were required, including a more transparent and robust election process for members of the African Union Commission. Proposed reforms to African Union mechanisms include strengthening of the African peer review mechanism to track implementation and evaluation in key governance areas of the continent, review and clarify the functions of judicial organs as well as the Pan-African Parliament, while also assessing their progress, strengthening working methods of the Peace and Security Council and developing clear rules for its operation, making the African passport available to all citizens without delay, and reforming the way meetings are conducted to make them more productive. When it comes to financing the African Union, Kagame and the committee were adamant that the body must become self-sustainable, stating that African Union programs are 97% funded by external donors, and as of December 2016, less than half of member states had paid their assessment in full. In response to this, the team backed a proposal set out by Donald Kaberuka in Kigali last year that set out a plan to raise $1.2 billion from member countries to fund AU activities. The committee also suggested that the scale of contributions be revised based on ability to pay and equitable burden sharing to avoid risk concentration. While the proposed reforms will be taken forward by the newly elected African Union Commission, Kagame warned that the key problem facing the AU is lack of implementation of previous resolutions and reforms. He cautioned that the reform agenda will come to nothing unless member states resolve to do things differently and take ownership of the key changes at the continental body. Matthew Edwards, CGTN.
And we continue our discussion now, and I still have my expert guest standing by in Lagos, Fisayo Alo, Senior Researcher, Good Governance Africa, and with me in Nairobi, political scientist and expert on the African Union, Muthoni Wanyeki. I want to go back to the reforms at the African Union as presented by Rwanda's President Kagame. One of the things he mentioned was there was a need to realign and re-energize the African Union to improve its performance. Talk to me about the realigning and re-energizing the African Union. How do we re-energize the African Union?
Well, I think the process has been ongoing. I mean, there's been a steady replacement of sort of older people who were with the old AU to young professionals who are really dynamic, who are really skilled in the fields that they work with. So staffing is one of it. But really the question is integrating the different parts of the AU, like I said. On the one hand, most focus obviously has been put on the peace and security side of things, but insecurity and conflict is driven by, you know, democratic questions, resource management questions, etc., on the governance side. So that's one of the proposals. How do you use the early warning system in a way that integrates what's coming from DPA? That's one of the moves forward. I think also is really the realization of what a disconnect there is now between the people in Africa and the AU. I was at a youth convening at the end of last year, youth leaders from all these really energetic pro-democracy movements across the continent. They are so disillusioned. I happen to be a believer in the AU. I believe in the transition process. I want it to work. We need it to work. But it was striking to me to realize that my own sense of belief was so out of touch with what youth expectations are, because they've seen, you know, AU interventions, proposals not coming to fruition. They're seeing sort of promises of coordination in one area or another that never come through. And I think really the new leadership at the AU needs to take stock of what's happened since 2002 to now that they've lost the people. That's really important. And second, like I say, is to move on this.
This year, though, the African Union has made youth initiatives an agenda at the AU. Actually, the theme and the agenda for the year will be on youth.
And yet, civil society and the youth movements that represent the most dynamic part of our continent were locked out of the summit in July, locked out in January. And that was not the intention. We have to have open participation, transparency, have the forums be a place for people to meet and share ideas, and not in a very structured, bureaucratic way, but in a way that they really hear what's coming from people's movements across the continent.
Right. Fisalo, do you feel that there is a disconnect, though, between the AU ideals of today and what the people of Africa really want from the African Union?
Okay, well, like I said earlier, I'm not so sure there's a disconnect. Well, maybe where the disconnect is actually in translating what we have on paper to actually what is being implemented or what is being done or what we're experiencing as the AU operates, you know, right now. I think one of the major things that the AU needs to do is to mobilize from the grassroots, you know, from each member state, because this would actually cause, a leap in better implementation of policies and a better connection between those people who are making the policies and the people who the policies are being made for. You know, the African states would have to understand the fact that they need to, you know, be committed to the agenda. They don't just set the agenda without having any commitment to, you know, implementing the agenda. Not just put it on paper, but make sure that you operationalize those agenda. That's where the connection, you know, will come to be.
Right. So if you look at the focus of the African Union over the last few years, one of them has been the ICC. Peace and security has been quite strong, but when it came to the Gambia, it was actually ECOWAS that moved in to salvage that situation. What happens with the African Union?
Well, ECOWAS coming in is actually the design. The REC, the responsible REC, is meant to have first dibs at intervention. And I think ECOWAS really is a sort of strong example. Its intervention, its threat of military intervention was not unprecedented. You know, it was Nigeria, ECOWAS led by Nigeria, that intervened in Liberia and Sierra Leone and sort of said, we've had enough of this situation. And that's the difference, I think, between ECOWAS, the AU, and perhaps the UN. The AU is more prepared for offensive preventive operations. But if you look at the standards of ECOWAS compared to, say, the standards of performance of IGAD or the EAC was never set up to be a peace and security body, and yet it's intervening in the case of Burundi quite ineffectively. IGAD was set up to be a security body, but it is very hesitant, very sort of pro-status quo in terms of how it's been operating. So I think lessons need to be learned with the RECs, but also this design of the AU, that the RECs intervene first and the AU only comes in if the RECs fail. That's actually what they're grappling with on South Sudan, on Burundi, is sort of how do they come in a manner that doesn't, offend the RECs. So there are some learnings that we have, good and bad, around this design question that need to be dealt with.
Right, Fisalo, but then what is it then that makes ECOWAS more effective when it comes to interventions in West African situations that perhaps other regional economic communities are unable to do, for instance, the EAC in Sudan, in Burundi, and so forth?
Well, I think the political stability that has characterized the West Africa, the ECOWAS states over the years, as relatively, has actually helped them to be more stable, in carrying out their own agenda. And I think other regions should, try to emulate this. Nigeria being, the central leader around the ECOWAS has also been a major factor. So I think for other regions, we could actually have a situation where those bigger countries who have, the clouds and the, the funds and what have you, to actually take the lead, to drive the agendas of this, regional bodies. ECOWAS has been majorly successful because of the peace around. And so that underscores the fact that, yes, you actually need that peace, and you need that to, to foster economic development in all the regions. If we are able to get each of the states, to obey the rule of law, to, entrench democracy and encourage participation, this is going to transcend to every, to the continent at large.
Right, a final comment from you, Muthoni, because President Kagame and his team did present the proposals for reforms of the African Union. But as we heard earlier from on this panel, though, implementation has been a weakness for the African Union in terms of financing. Already, the African Union is talking about half of the member states have yet to pay up their dues. In terms of peace and security architecture, that in terms of intervention, where do you see the African Union having the most success in its reform program?
Well, I think leadership is critical, and I think at least at the continental level, this team of Kagame Kaberuka is providing that leadership. I hope this change of guard also, generally new people come in and they want to see things move. Fundamentally what they need, and I think the colleague in Nigeria just pointed this out, the hegemons within the region, the Nigerias, the South Africas, the Algerias, need to step up and lead by example. That's sort of incentivized by good example, and hopefully, the smaller states will fall underway. But also, there does need to be consequence for people who don't pay their dues, who blatantly violate, whether it's the agreement on democracy, whether it's the agreement on peace and security, whatever they are violating, the Human Rights Charter. People need to see that there are consequences for this, and consequences that go beyond ineffective kind of finger waving. And I think what happened in ECOWAS, which the colleague spoke to, is there was a consequence.
Right. Fisalo, where do you see the African Union reforms having the most impact going forward?
Well, I would like to see the African Union to be able to provide, that enabling environment within the continent where there is free trade, and where people will be able to move around. We need to remove some barriers, that has hindered the people from moving around. This has hindered trade. This has hindered, sharing values and making sure that. That there's free flow of trade. All
right, we'll leave it there for the moment, and thank you all for participating in this discussion. That's all we have time for this week, but thank you to my guests for their insights. In Lagos, Fisayo Alo, he's a senior researcher at Good Governance Africa, and with me in Nairobi, political scientist and expert on the African Union, Muthoni Wanyeke. Thank you for joining on the program. Remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. Goodbye.